He thought humiliating her would prove a point, but by the end of the night, Daniel Carter would realize he had just destroyed the one person who made everything he owned possible. The ballroom shimmered under cascading crystal chandeliers, their golden light reflecting off polished marble floors that stretched wider than a football field, every inch filled with America's elite. Venture capitalists, tech founders, old money families draped in tailored tuxedos and couture gowns that whispered status with every step. At the center of it all stood Daniel Carter, a billionaire whose name alone could move markets, his navy suit cut to perfection, his confidence filling the room like a silent command. And beside him, almost invisible in comparison, stood Emily Carter. She wore a simple ivory dress, elegant but understated, her hair pulled back neatly, her presence quiet in a space designed for spectacle. To the untrained eye, she didn't belong. And that was exactly what they thought. Conversations dipped as people glanced her way, subtle smiles exchanged behind champagne flutes, the kind of quiet judgment that never needed words. Daniel noticed it too, but instead of shielding her, something colder moved behind his eyes. The music softened as the host tapped the microphone, announcing Daniel as one of the evening's most important guests, a key investor behind the gala's success. Applause filled the room, polite at first, then swelling as Daniel stepped forward, his hand brushing Emily's arm as if guiding her into a role she never asked for. He took the glass of champagne from a passing server, raising it slightly, the room instinctively leaning in. Tonight, he began, his voice smooth, practiced, is about recognizing excellence, about knowing who belongs in rooms like this. A few light chuckles rippled through the crowd, the kind that came easy among people who believed they understood the rules of power. Daniel paused just long enough for the silence to sharpen. Then, with a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, he turned his gaze toward Emily. And sometimes, he added, almost casually, it's about learning who doesn't. The words landed softly, but the effect was immediate. A hush spread across the ballroom, delicate, electric. Emily didn't move. Her hands remained lightly clasped in front of her, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. But the shift in the room was undeniable. Some guests looked away, uncomfortable. Others watched more closely, curiosity replacing politeness. Daniel let out a quiet breath, as if he had just delivered a harmless joke, something clever, something justified. Of course, he continued, gesturing lightly toward Emily. We all have our roles. Some build empires, and some simply benefit from them. A few people laughed this time, short, uncertain bursts that echoed awkwardly against the high ceilings. Daniel smiled, satisfied, believing he had reasserted something that needed reminding. But Emily's eyes lifted then, calm, steady, and impossibly composed. She looked at him, not with anger, not with embarrassment, but with something far more unsettling, understanding. And in that quiet moment, before anyone could speak, before the music could return, she gave the faintest smile and said softly, I suppose you're right. The room didn't know it yet, but something had just shifted, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything Daniel Carter had ever bought. The silence did not break right away. It lingered like a weight pressing against every polished surface in the room. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Carter felt something he could not immediately control, not fear, not yet, but a subtle disruption in the rhythm he had mastered for years. Because Emily did not react the way anyone expected, she did not lower her gaze. She did not rush to excuse the moment. She did not even attempt to leave. Instead, she simply stood there, her shoulders relaxed, her expression calm in a way that felt almost out of place against the tension surrounding her. And that quiet composure began to draw attention in a different way, the kind that made people look twice, then 3 times, as if trying to reconcile what they had just witnessed with what they thought they understood, while across the room a few guests exchanged glances that carried more than curiosity. There was recognition in some of those looks, faint but unmistakable, as though pieces of a puzzle were beginning to shift into place. Daniel, however, mistook the silence for agreement. He lifted his glass again, forcing a small laugh that echoed slightly too loud, attempting to steer the moment back under his control. Well, he said, his tone lighter now, almost dismissive. We all have to know our place, do not we? A few scattered chuckles followed, weaker this time, less certain, but he pressed on, because stopping would mean acknowledging something had gone wrong, and Daniel Carter did not acknowledge weakness, not in public, not ever. He turned slightly away from Emily, already signaling the end of the moment in his mind, already preparing to move on to safer conversations, to investors, to deals, to numbers that always made sense. But before he could take a step, a voice carried across the room, clear, composed, and entirely unexpected. "Actually, Mr. Carter," the voice said, cutting cleanly through the lingering tension. And just like that, the room shifted. Again, heads turning toward the source, conversations halting mid-sentence. A man stepped forward from the far side of the ballroom, his presence quiet but commanding, not loud, not dramatic, yet instantly recognized by those who understood influence beyond surface appearances. He wore a simple black tuxedo, nothing flashy, but his posture and the subtle way people around him made space spoke volumes. Daniel's expression flickered for the briefest moment as he tried to place him, while Emily did not turn right away. She remained still, as if she already knew what was coming. The man continued walking until he stood just a few feet away, his eyes moving from Daniel to Emily with a measured calm. "I believe there may be some confusion about roles here tonight," he added, his tone polite, but carrying an edge of authority that could not be ignored. The room went quieter still, if that was even possible. And somewhere near the back, a glass was set down just a little too hard, the faint sound echoing like a signal. Daniel straightened slightly, instinctively reclaiming his posture, his confidence returning in layers, because in his world, introductions solved everything. Identities clarified power. "And you are?" Daniel asked, his voice controlled again, but sharper now. The man offered a small, almost knowing smile before answering. "Jonathan Reeves," he said, pausing just long enough for the name to settle into the room. And for those who recognized it, the shift was immediate. Subtle movements, exchanged looks, a ripple of awareness spreading outward. "Chairman of the Carter Foundation Board," he added, his gaze returning to Emily. "And I think it is time we acknowledge the person who made tonight possible." Daniel's grip on his glass tightened slightly, just enough for the tension to show. And for the first time that evening, uncertainty slipped into his eyes, because something in the room had changed, and it was no longer following his script. Daniel Carter did not speak immediately, and that alone was enough to unsettle the room, because a man like him always had an answer, always had control, yet now his silence stretched just a second too long, and in that second, the weight of Jonathan Reeves' words began to settle into every corner of the ballroom. Emily finally turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting Jonathan's with quiet recognition, not surprise, not confusion, but something far more telling, familiarity, the kind that did not need explanation. And that subtle exchange did not go unnoticed, especially by those who understood how power truly moved beneath polished surfaces. Jonathan inclined his head toward her, respectful, almost deferential, a gesture so small yet so out of place in this environment that it caused a visible ripple through the guests. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his mind moving quickly now, trying to reassemble a narrative that still placed him at the center. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice steady but edged with something sharper. "Emily is here as my guest." The words sounded correct, logical, the kind that usually restored order, but tonight they landed differently. Because Jonathan did not look at Daniel when he responded, he kept his attention on Emily. "With respect," he said calmly, "this event exists because of her." The sentence was simple, but it landed with the force of something far larger. A few guests shifted in place. Others leaned forward slightly, the air tightening again. Daniel let out a short breath that almost resembled a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "That is not how this works," he replied, his tone controlled, measured. "I funded this foundation. I built the partnerships. I brought the investors into this room." Each word sounded like a reinforcement of reality as he knew it. And for a moment, the room held on to that version, because it was familiar, comfortable, predictable. But Jonathan's expression did not change. "You presented the vision," he acknowledged, "but the capital that sustained it, the initial endowment, the strategic acquisitions that allowed it to expand nationwide, those came from a private trust." He paused, letting the words breathe, letting them reach the edges of the room. A trust managed and directed by Emily Carter. The silence that followed was no longer delicate. It was absolute, complete. The kind that made every small movement sound amplified. Someone shifted their weight. A chair leg brushed softly against marble. The faint hum of the air system suddenly noticeable. Daniel blinked once, slowly, as if recalibrating, his eyes moving to Emily with a new intensity, searching for something that would contradict what he had just heard, something that would restore the version of reality he had always believed. But Emily did not rush to explain. She did not step forward to claim anything. She simply stood there, composed, her hands still lightly clasped, her expression calm, almost gentle, and that calmness made everything else louder. Jonathan continued, his voice steady, unhurried. For the past 8 years, every major investment tied to the Carter Foundation has required her authorization, her oversight, her approval. Another pause, longer this time, including tonight's gala. A soft murmur began to form at the edges of the crowd, quickly suppressed but impossible to ignore. Daniel's grip tightened around his glass again, not enough to draw attention, but enough to betray the shift inside him, because the pieces were no longer aligning. The narrative he controlled was no longer complete, and for the first time, the room was no longer looking at him as the source of power. Their attention had moved, subtly but decisively, toward the woman he had just dismissed, and in that shift, something irreversible had begun. Daniel Carter felt the shift before he fully understood it, the subtle but unmistakable change in how the room held itself, how conversations no longer orbited him but hovered somewhere just beyond his reach. And for a man who had built his life on control, on precision, on always being the one people turned toward, that loss of center was disorienting in a way he could not immediately mask. He straightened his posture, adjusting his jacket with deliberate care, a practiced motion meant to restore composure. But the gesture felt heavier now, as if the fabric itself carried the weight of what had just been revealed. "That is not possible," he said finally, his voice lower, more controlled, but lacking the effortless confidence it once carried. "If that were true, I would know." The statement sounded firm, logical, the kind that once ended conversations, but tonight it lingered in the air without authority. Jonathan Reeves watched him for a moment, not with challenge, not with hostility, but with a quiet patience that suggested this outcome had been inevitable. "You were informed," Jonathan replied calmly. "But not everything was presented in a way you chose to understand." A few guests exchanged glances at that, the meaning clear without needing explanation. Daniel's eyes flicked back to Emily, searching again, this time not for contradiction, but for confirmation, for denial, for anything that would anchor him back to certainty. But Emily remained exactly as she had been, composed, steady, her presence now drawing the full attention of the room without a single effort to claim it. The host of the gala, who had been standing near the stage, hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, his smile carefully reconstructed, though it did not fully reach his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice slightly tighter than before. "Perhaps this is the perfect moment to properly recognize the individual whose vision and support made tonight possible." The words were formal, but the implication was unmistakable, and as he turned toward Emily, the movement of the crowd followed, like a tide shifting direction. Daniel remained still, just a fraction behind the motion, no longer leading it. And that was when Emily finally moved, just a small step forward, not dramatic, not rushed, but deliberate, the kind of movement that carried quiet authority. She did not look at the crowd first. She looked at Daniel, and for a brief moment, everything else faded. The music, the murmurs, the glow of chandeliers, all of it receded into a distant backdrop. "You were not wrong," she said softly, her voice clear enough to carry without force. "We do all have our roles." The words echoed his own from moments earlier, but now they carried a different weight, something deeper, something final. Daniel's expression tightened, a flicker of realization beginning to surface, but it came too late, because Emily continued, her tone calm, steady. "You built something remarkable, Daniel," she acknowledged, and there was no sarcasm in it, no bitterness, only truth. "But you never asked where the foundation came from." A pause followed, not long, But enough. Enough for the meaning to settle. Enough for the room to understand before she said anything more, or who made sure it never collapsed. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than before, more complete. Because now it carried understanding, and in that understanding, the balance of power did not just shift, it settled, firmly, unmistakably, and Daniel Carter, for the first time in years, stood in a room where he was no longer the one in control. The silence did not fade this time. It deepened, settling into the bones of the room as if every person present suddenly understood they were witnessing something far more than a social misstep. This was a shift in truth, in power, in perception, and Daniel Carter could feel it slipping through his fingers with every passing second. He looked at Emily again, but this time there was no confidence behind his gaze, only calculation, rapid and strained, as if he could still find a way to contain what had already escaped. "Emily," he said, his voice lower now, no longer projecting, no longer commanding, but searching. "This is not necessary." The words were meant to pull her back, to reframe the moment as something private, something manageable, but they landed weakly in the open air of the ballroom, because nothing about this was private anymore. Emily held his gaze for a brief moment, and in that moment there was no anger, no triumph, only clarity, the kind that came from years of quiet observation, years of standing just outside the spotlight while understanding exactly how it worked. "It became necessary the moment you decided it was acceptable," she replied softly, her voice steady, carrying just enough to reach the edges of the room without ever rising. A few guests shifted again, not out of discomfort now, but out of recognition. The kind that comes when something unspoken is finally said aloud. Daniel exhaled slowly, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the strain beneath. "You are making this into something it is not," he said, though even he seemed less certain of that statement. And that was when Jonathan Reeves stepped slightly forward again, not to interrupt, but to anchor what was already unfolding. "With respect," Jonathan said, his tone calm but firm. "This has always been something. It was simply not acknowledged." His words did not escalate the tension, they clarified it. And clarity can be more powerful than confrontation. The host stood frozen near the stage, unsure whether to proceed or retreat, while the guests, the investors, the people who once orbited Daniel with certainty, now watched Emily with a different kind of attention, one built on understanding rather than assumption. Emily turned slightly then, not toward Daniel, but toward the room, her posture unchanged, her presence now unmistakably centered. "For years," she said, her voice calm, almost reflective, "I chose to remain in the background, not because I lacked a place here, but because I believed that what we were building mattered more than recognition." Her words carried weight, not because they were loud, but because they were precise, every sentence landing exactly where it needed to. "I believe that respect did not need to be announced," she continued, "that it would exist naturally in the way people treat each other." A brief pause followed, and in that pause, the room held its breath, because they already knew what was coming next. Tonight proved otherwise, she finished, simply, without emphasis, without anger, just truth. Daniel looked around then, truly looked, and what he saw was not admiration, not agreement, but distance, subtle yet undeniable. The kind that grows when perception changes, when certainty breaks, when someone realizes they have misjudged not just a person, but the foundation of everything they believed. His grip on control was no longer slipping. It was gone, replaced by something far more fragile, understanding, and as Emily stood there, calm and unwavering, it became clear to everyone in that room that this was not a moment of embarrassment. It was a moment of reckoning, and Daniel Carter was no longer the one defining it. The room did not erupt into noise or chaos. It did something far more telling. It stayed quiet, but the quality of that silence had changed. It was no longer passive, no longer uncertain. It had become aware, deliberate, almost reflective, as if every person present was recalculating what they thought they knew. And Daniel Carter stood at the center of that recalculation without the shield he had relied on for years. His name, his wealth, his reputation, all of it suddenly felt less certain. Under the weight of what had just been revealed, he glanced toward the investors he had spoken to earlier in the evening, men who had once leaned in when he spoke, who had measured their next moves by his confidence. But now their expressions were measured, distant, their attention divided, not dismissive, but no longer anchored to him. And that subtle shift carried more consequence than any direct confrontation ever could. "We can discuss this privately," Daniel said finally, his voice controlled but stripped of its earlier ease, the words directed toward Emily, but the intention clear. He wanted to contain the moment, to move it out of public view, to regain ground where perception could be managed. But Emily did not move toward him. She did not lower her voice. She did not retreat. Instead, she turned slightly more toward the room, acknowledging its presence rather than avoiding it. "There is nothing here that requires hiding," she said calmly, and the simplicity of her words made them heavier, because they removed any path back to illusion. Jonathan Reeves remained just behind her, not leading, not overshadowing, but reinforcing the quiet authority she now carried. "The Foundation's records are transparent," he added, his tone even. "Every contribution, every decision, every directive is documented and attributed correctly." A few guests nodded subtly, recognizing the implication. This was not a narrative being constructed in the moment. It was a reality that had always existed, simply unspoken. Daniel felt the pressure build in a different way now, not through confrontation, but through exposure, the kind that does not attack, but reveals, and revelation leaves little room to maneuver. He exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance again, trying to regain some form of equilibrium. "Emily," he said, softer now, almost measured in a different way. "If there has been a misunderstanding, we can correct it." The phrasing shifted, no longer dismissive, no longer commanding, but seeking resolution. Yet even that carried an undertone of control, as if the situation could still be shaped into something acceptable. Emily looked at him for a moment, and in that look there was recognition, not of his status, but of his attempt, the same attempt she had seen many times before, to define reality in a way that served him best. "This is not a misunderstanding," she replied gently. "This is clarity." And that word settled into the room with a finality that could not be undone, because clarity does not argue, it does not escalate, it simply exists, and in its presence, everything else must adjust. Daniel's shoulders lowered just slightly, not in defeat, but in realization, the kind that arrives too late to prevent consequence. And around them, the room no longer waited for his next move. It watched Emily instead, not with curiosity anymore, but with acknowledgement, because in that moment, the balance had fully shifted, not through force, not through confrontation, but through truth revealed at exactly the right time. And Daniel Carter, who had built his life on being seen, now stood in a room where he was finally understood in a way he could not control. The shift in the room was no longer subtle. It had settled into something permanent, something that did not need to be announced because everyone could feel it. And as the silence stretched, it was no longer centered on Daniel Carter. It was anchored around Emily, the woman who had stood unnoticed just minutes ago, and now held the quiet gravity of the entire space without raising her voice or demanding attention. A few of the guests who had once laughed earlier now avoided her gaze, not out of shame alone, but out of the uncomfortable realization that they had participated in something they did not fully understand, while others, those more perceptive, began to step slightly closer, not physically, but in posture, in attention, in the subtle shift of respect that cannot be faked. Daniel noticed it all, every glance, every recalibrated expression, every moment that did not return to him the way it once would have. And for a man who had built influence on perception, the loss of that invisible current was undeniable. "Emily," he said again, but this time the name carried no authority, only recognition, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time in years, and that realization alone carried its own weight. She turned to him once more, not out of obligation, but out of choice, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged. "You always knew," she said quietly, and the statement did not accuse. It revealed. Daniel's brow tightened slightly, confusion flickering before. Understanding began to take its place. "You knew I was involved," she continued. "You knew the funding came from somewhere beyond your immediate network. You knew decisions were being made that protected your risks." Each sentence was measured, precise, and with each one, the room seemed to lean closer, drawn not by drama, but by clarity. But you never asked who was behind it, she finished, and that was where the truth settled. Not in what was hidden, but in what was ignored. Daniel let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when a realization can no longer be delayed, his shoulders lowering slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, because he could not deny it. There had been moments, small details, quiet patterns that did not fully align with his understanding, but he had accepted them without question, because they worked in his favor, because they supported his narrative, and questioning them would have required him to look beyond himself. Something he had never needed to do, until now, I thought, he began, but the sentence did not finish, because whatever he thought no longer held weight in the present moment. Emily watched him for a second longer, and then something shifted again, not in the room, but in her, a quiet finality, as if a decision long in the making had reached its natural conclusion. I know, she said softly, and there was no bitterness in it, only closure. Jonathan Reeves stepped forward just enough to be seen without interrupting the moment, his presence reinforcing what had already been made clear. There is one more matter that should be addressed, he said, his tone calm but deliberate. And that sentence carried a different kind of weight, the kind that signaled not just revelation, but consequence. Daniel's eyes moved toward him quickly, instinctively, because this was something he could not predict, could not control, and for the first time that evening, anticipation replaced certainty. The room stilled once more. Every movement paused, every conversation fully silenced. Because whatever came next would not simply shift perception, it would define what remained after it. Jonathan Reeves did not raise his voice, yet the moment he began to speak, the room leaned in as if pulled by something invisible. Effective immediately, he said, each word measured, deliberate. The primary trust funding the Carter Foundation has been restructured. A faint ripple moved through the guests, subtle but undeniable, the kind that comes when something significant is about to be understood. Daniel's posture stiffened again, his instincts returning, searching for control in numbers, in structure, in anything that could be quantified and therefore managed. Restructured how? He asked quickly, the sharpness back in his tone, but now it carried urgency rather than authority. Jonathan did not look at him right away. He turned slightly toward Emily instead, a silent acknowledgement of where the true authority now rested. Under Emily Carter's direction, he continued, the trust has withdrawn its active capital position from all ventures that do not meet its revised governance standards. The words were formal, almost technical, but their meaning landed clearly for those who understood finance, for those who knew how quickly influence could shift when capital moved. A low murmur began to form, quickly suppressed but impossible to ignore. Daniel's expression tightened, the implications assembling in real time. You are saying the foundation is pulling out? He asked, more controlled now, but the question carried weight. Jonathan nodded slightly. Not the foundation, he clarified, the capital behind it. A pause followed, just long enough for the distinction to settle. Which has supported the majority of your external partnerships for the past 8 years. That was when it landed fully, not just for Daniel, but for everyone listening. The foundation was not just a charitable entity. It was a network, a structure, a financial backbone that connected to ventures far beyond what had been publicly acknowledged. And if that backbone shifted, the impact would not remain contained. Daniel's grip on his glass loosened slightly, not from weakness, but from recalculation. The kind that happens when a man realizes the system he believed he controlled was never entirely his. This is not how agreements work, he said, though even as he spoke, the certainty in his voice was thinning. Jonathan's response was immediate, calm, and unshaken. All agreements were structured with discretionary clauses, he said, specifically to allow the principal director to reassess alignment. His gaze moved briefly to Emily again, reinforcing the point without stating it directly. She had always been that principal. Daniel's mind moved quickly through contracts, signatures, meetings he half remembered, documents he had reviewed but not fully questioned, because they had always worked in his favor, until now. Emily finally stepped forward again, just enough to close the space between herself and the center of the room, her presence steady, grounded. Nothing is being taken away unfairly, she said calmly, her voice carrying without effort. Everything is simply being returned to its original intent. Her words were not defensive, not aggressive. They were precise, and that precision made them undeniable. The purpose was never to build power without accountability, she added, her eyes briefly meeting Daniel's. And tonight made it clear that accountability is no longer aligned. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than any before, because now the consequence was no longer abstract, it was real, it was immediate, and it was irreversible. Daniel stood there, no longer the axis of the room, no longer the unquestioned authority he had been just an hour ago, and for the first time in years, he understood what it meant to lose control not through force, but through truth. As the realization settled, the room did not erupt, it did not react dramatically, it simply absorbed the shift. And in that quiet absorption, everything Daniel Carter had built began to feel just a little less certain. No one spoke for several seconds, not because they did not know what to say, but because they finally understood there was nothing left to correct, nothing left to reinterpret. The truth had already settled into the room with a quiet finality that no amount of influence could reverse, and Daniel Carter stood in the center of it, not as the architect of the evening, but as the man who had misjudged its foundation entirely. His eyes moved once more across the faces around him, searching not for support now, but for something familiar, something that still responded to him the way it always had. But what he found instead was distance, measured, composed, and undeniable, the kind that does not come from anger, but from clarity, because once people understand something fully, they do not return to the version they believed before. Emily remained still for a moment longer, allowing the weight of everything to settle without rushing it, without forcing a conclusion, because the conclusion had already arrived on its own. She did not need to declare victory. She did not need to emphasize the shift. It was already visible in every glance, every subtle adjustment in posture around the room. And then, without announcement, she turned slightly, her movement calm and deliberate, the kind that did not seek attention yet drew it naturally. Jonathan Reeves stepped back just enough to give her space, his role complete, no longer guiding, only acknowledging. Daniel watched her, not with the authority he once carried, but with a realization that came too late to change anything. "Emily," he said quietly, her name no longer a command, no longer even a request, but something closer to recognition. She paused, just briefly, enough to acknowledge that he had spoken, but she did not turn back fully. "There are things that cannot be rebuilt once they are revealed," she said softly, and her words did not carry accusation. They carried truth, not because they were destroyed, but because they were never understood to begin with. The sentence settled into the silence with a quiet permanence, and Daniel did not respond, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to redefine. For the first time, he understood that control had never been the same as understanding, and that difference had cost him more than he had realized. Emily took another step forward, moving toward the edge of the ballroom, her presence no longer questioned, no longer minimized, the space around her opening naturally as people made room without being asked, not out of obligation, but out of respect that had finally found its place. The chandeliers still glowed above, the music still lingered faintly in the background, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be reversed. Daniel remained where he was, not stopped, not restrained, but simply unable to follow in the way he once would have, because the distance between them was no longer physical. It was defined by something far deeper, something he could not close with words or power. And as Emily reached the doors, she did not look back again, not out of indifference, but because there was nothing left behind that required her return. The doors opened quietly, the night air just beyond carrying a stillness that matched her own, and as she stepped through, the room behind her remained silent, not in shock, not in confusion, but in understanding. And in that silence, one truth lingered, clear and undeniable, that respect is not granted by status, and once it is lost, no amount of power can buy it back.